procedures that are flouted on the European continent will be flouted in even bigger proportion elsewhere. And this would give us even an additional work in other parts of the world where the core of our activities is. I'll stop it here.
Thank you very much for those introductory remarks. Very important issues, critical issues, not only from political point of view, but also from moral and ethical point of view. In this discussion, I'm joined by two of my great colleagues. Melanie Kamet is a professor of government at Harvard, and her research focuses on the governance and provision of social services in by public and private actors in Middle East. Jennifer Lanning is professor of practice of health and human rights at Harvard Chan School of Public Health. She's a director of AXB Center for Health and Human Rights, and of course co-founder of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Jennifer has been working tirelessly helping refugees in many countries. She personally took part in providing medical care and public services on the ground to refugees almost in every single big crisis we had over the last 20 years. So we have a lot of things to discuss, a lot of experience around this table. And maybe we'll start with some questions, comments from my colleagues, and then I will open the floor for a broad general discussion. Melanie, would you like to say?
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's a real honor, and to hear these important words, and congratulations on receiving the inaugural award. This is, I think, very well deserved, and also gratitude for all the important work that you and the ICRC are doing. I really appreciate the efforts to put the crisis in perspective and to point out that as a proportion of total population in the European Union, the migrant crisis coming largely out of Syria and other places as well is really minimal. And so the political reaction is really what's at root here. So, it's refreshing to hear the calling a spade and homing in on the political dimensions here that shape responses to the crisis. And it makes it all the more embarrassing that this has become a political issue in the United States, where the flow of refugees is truly infinitesimal. So we can put it in perspective there as well. So I wanted to raise a few issues or questions. I'd love to hear Dr. Mauer's thoughts on these issues and more. First, I think it's also refreshing to hear about solutions that have been tried, at least in the pilot stage, and work, because we hear a narrative of crisis, and disaster, which is true. Both things can be true, but also that there are things that work. So there are some sort of glimmers of hope here. And again, depressing to hear that there are political obstacles to scale them, but perhaps over time these political obstacles will evolve. And I have some questions about that as well. So I'd be curious to hear more about these kinds of programs and how they differ in different locations. So, for example, there are things that are being proposed, I gather, in European countries, say in Germany or other countries that have received large numbers or relatively large numbers of refugees. But also, of course, the largest flows of refugees are in the neighboring countries of Syria in particular. And I'd be curious to hear what is being done there, what can be done there. Recently there was a paper by a scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center advocating a focus on what he referred to as smart policies to address refugee crises, ones that focus not just on short-term relief, but also longer-term issues, because we know this conflict in Syria and other conflicts are not going to be resolved anytime soon. They're very protracted, they're very complicated. We've got lots of domestic actors on the ground complicating the resolution, but also a lot of regional and international actors. So it makes it quite a complex scenario to reach a true agreement. And even when an agreement is reached, I'm sure will be under threat for quite some time. So what kinds of policies can be done to address the well-being of populations that are displaced and in neighboring countries in a sort of medium to longer term framework? Because there are quite a few restrictions on employment, labor market restrictions. We know that in Lebanon, for example, I think something like half of Syrian refugee children are not able to receive education. Maybe that number's not quite right, but it's a large proportion, and other surrounding countries as well. So what kind of things can be done given the very real political constraints that operate in these countries, enshrined in law in terms of restrictions on employment and so forth? Are there creative ways to sort of foster more productive labor markets around refugee communities and so forth? And that gives rise to another set of questions of interest to me as a political scientist, which is each of the, I know best Middle Eastern countries and how they're adapting to these crises, and each of the major receiving countries around Syria has a very different institutional context, and this very much shapes the way responding to refugee outflows takes place and manifests itself. So, for example, in Lebanon, for various historical reasons, the government decided not to allow the construction of camps and not to deal with the crisis in that way, whereas in Jordan there have been camps created and so forth. So how does that shape the international humanitarian response? How does that facilitate things or complicate things? In Lebanon, you have in the welfare regime multiple non-state actors, private actors delivering basic services in times of non-crisis, in normal times. So it's a very different context than in, say, Jordan or Turkey, for example, where you have different levels of state capacity and so forth. So I imagine that the humanitarian response from the international side filters through this distinct international context. A couple more things that came to mind. We know that the effects of war continue long after the war ends. And again, I don't think that this war in Syria is going to end anytime soon. I hope I'm wrong, but it's not looking good. And the effects go on in terms of health effects, in terms of educational systems, in terms of labor markets, infrastructure, and so forth. And a number of international organizations have come out with reports documenting the lost generation in Syria of children that are out of school. And this is really disastrous because there's all kinds of second order, third order effects that play out in terms of future prospects for economic development, getting Syria back to anywhere near the level it was at before the crisis in terms of human development outcomes. It also might be, from a very cynical perspective, these kinds of things might be of interest to European policymakers because there is a fair amount of research that shows that one of the major drivers of recruitment in extremist organizations is exclusion, socioeconomic exclusion, and so not to make a purely reductionist interpretation of the rise of extremist organizations, but it's clear that economic factors are critical for some important proportion of recruits to these organizations, and poor educational and job market prospects are key here. So perhaps cynically, this is a body of research that needs to get projected more loudly into European capitals and into Brussels and elsewhere. And that actually brings me to a final question, which is, does this crisis winding up on European shores and in European territories open up opportunities for addressing the root causes of these refugee outflows? Now that people are fleeing the disastrous situation in their home countries and winding up as far as Europe, does this actually provide some incentive for politicians to come together and try to address them? So on the one hand, we have these political responses that are not productive at all, that you've outlined very clearly and we're seeing reported in the news repeatedly, but does it also potentially open up a window of opportunity? This is certainly the way that voices from the Middle East have looked at this very cynically, saying, oh, well, now that they're winding up in Europe and they're not just in camps in Jordan or in informal gatherings and communities in Lebanon and in Turkey and so forth, maybe there will be more of an effort to resolve these crises at their root causes. So thank you very much for your remarks.
Thank you, Melanie. Jennifer, please.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and
Could you speak to the mic?
I beg your pardon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and warmest thanks and greetings to the Whitens family, and I hope you now realize that this first choice for the inaugural honoree was enlightened and splendid choice. Peter Maurer is a extraordinarily esteemed and respected leader, diplomat, philosopher, and public voice in the war and humanitarian space. And so it's a great honor to be in some way attached to your presentation today. And Melanie, I loved your questions. Answering them will take up a good share of whatever time we might have, but they're very, very, very important questions. My thanks to the Center for European Studies for hosting this, because it is, although it's a small crowd, it's an intense crowd. And could I just say that for the Whitens family who are not familiar with how things radiate out of this amphitheater, this is sort of a hot spot. You know, the things that happen here go far and wide. So it's a good place, Nikki. Thank you for working with the center to organize this. Thank you. I wrote down a number of things that I might say independently, and then I decided I would take Melanie's lead, which is actually allows me to say many things, but pose them towards you as questions. So the first off question is, what decided you to become much more outspoken on the European refugee crisis than I, as a student and admirer of the ICRC, would ever have anticipated? I mean, the International Committee of the Red Cross, solely and only among the humanitarian agencies, gains access and maintains its probity and independence by rarely speaking out in public about the violations of international law, international humanitarian law that it witnesses. It's closest to the action. It sees many more violations than any other humanitarian agency or any other actor, and yet its history has been to be quiet in order to report to governments and the military about the violations, in order, through the respect of silence and confidentiality, to not embarrass, but in fact persuade the major bad actors to change their practice. And in also order to gain access to those who are most caught up in war, which often are displaced peoples or prisoners held by the more malignant or hostile force, if one can parse most wars that way. A very important time when I was aware that the ICRC spoke out very, very intensely with a high tone of urgency and marked, not even implicit criticism of the international community, was in the early years of the growing famine in Somalia in the early 1990s. The ICRC spoke out extremely strongly. There have been a number of times since, but that speaking out, and I think since, has been more in defense of international humanitarian law than in a marked commentary on a massive and influential political network and force, which is the European Union. So what prompted it? And how much vetting did you have to do within your ICRC official line to do that? To the extent that you would like to share that, that's one question. The second is, there are two others are much more operational. I'm very interested in if you can share that with those of us who are here on the methods and strategies you have devised to support medical aid and trauma and surgical care within Syria in the context of your respect for national sovereignty, which means usually getting permission from the nation state, and the Assad regime is the nation state. In your usual insistence on working with at least one or two expat, internationally trained Red Cross workers to help supervise or at least co-run operations. And yet in a context now where presumably you have to be training local people to go in and do the bulk of the work. So this is, I'm just interested in the changes and approaches and the adaptations you've had to make in order to be effective in the areas you can reach, which we know are always spotty for everyone in terms of taking care of victims of violence in this war. There's very little, as you said, neutral and nonpartisan space in which to work. The third question, but the second in this more operational line, is have you ramped up your tracing work? I have always respected and been extremely grateful for the fact that the ICRC is prominent in tracing separated people in the setting of forced displacement and war. It's a fundamental action of the ICRC, that UNHCR does this to some extent. The coordination, I think, is not 100%, but the ICRC now, with the risks of so many people getting separated and so many people unidentified who are dying or are separated, how are these issues of intensification of separation, many children and young people at risk, and many people unidentified, how is this tracing aspect being scaled up, as you would say? And then the third question I have, which is on a larger scale of sort of politics and strategy, as was my first, is given your deep understanding of what prompts this current million to try to get into Europe, and what is going to be prompting another large number of people still from the Mideast, perhaps from Afghanistan and elsewhere, trying to get into Europe, and then what we are seeing and have seen prior to the war in Syria, a growing number of desperate people in this category of what we would call distress migration. They're not simply voluntary economic migrants, as you know well. So distress migration, fleeing poor governance, chronic conflict, and livelihoods collapsed, partly inflected by climate change. The millions that are trying to come from North Africa, the Sahelian states, and probably increasingly from sub-Saharan Africa. So in terms of your anticipation of migration and displaced peoples, what has been, if any, a change in your focus and strategy for Africa? Thank you for the opportunity to hear you speak another time.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think we have a bunch of really great questions, so Peter, if you could at least try some of them.
Indeed, the choice is difficult. I mean, of course, I agree with you that each and every one of the neighboring countries has very distinct realities, has different policies, but there are, again, a couple of things which are interesting and where we would be interesting also to engage with you and with the broader community here at Harvard to find solutions. And you mentioned the educational part. I think it's one of the aspects which we came to the conclusion that we were not equipped at the present moment to respond to the educational crisis caused by the conflicts of the last couple of years. We have always defined humanitarian as being water, sanitation, food, medicine, shelter. That's what we are able to do. We have skills and we are able to negotiate access to populations even in some of the most difficult circumstances to fulfill the fundamental needs. And education has never been part of the definition of humanitarian response. And so there is no frontline humanitarian actor who is able to deliver and to respond to some of the educational problems which emerge from the generations of displaced, but also for those who are not able to go to school because their schooling infrastructure has been destroyed by the conflict. So here again, the internally displaced versus refugee is an important issue. I have no response to that at the present moment. We are trying to map some of the initiatives which are taken to see whether we can cooperate and see how we can join forces, whether our ability to be at certain places where others have difficulties is opening opportunities. Again, as I said before, ICRC will not become a migration agency and we are not becoming an educational agency, but the question is, can we promote and facilitate the activities of others, and how can we tap into the capacities of others, and what are these capacities, and what are the new technologies that we can use and generate also in order to respond to some of those urgent needs of educations which today, there is no question to me, are integrated part of any reasonable humanitarian response to a crisis. The second remains with what I briefly mentioned is jobs and investments. And here again it's very interesting. I mean, because the countries are different from one to the other, the practices are different, but there are some important experiences. The Jordanians opened free economic zones to activities for Syrian refugees specifically, so they create specific areas of jobs in order to offer opportunities to the refugees to look after themselves. Letting them onto the labor market causes the tensions that we know each and everywhere. So you can't expect from a country, neither a neighboring country or a European, that they just open the labor market for whoever comes. It's too much for the social cohesion of the respective countries in Europe as well as in other places. So we need different forms and format of controlled openings of labor market, timings and sequencings and numbers, and this is part of the politics of each and every one of the country, but I think Turkey and Jordan have been very interested, have followed very interesting models on moving away from camps and offering targeted possibilities to bring people out of the camps. Let's be also very frank on what the politics behind is. When the Syrian crisis began, there was an illusion in the neighboring countries and in many countries beyond that this would be a short moment and a short displacement. They put people into the camps in the opinion that a year later Assad would be away and people would go happily back to Syria. And I agree with you, what you said. It's unlikely that this is a scenario, so there are new possibilities in terms of creating jobs and labor markets to look at. I have chaired over the last 2 years a working group in the context of the World Economic Forum on investment in fragile context. Very interesting. I think we have underestimated the potential and possibilities of small and medium enterprises to contribute to job creation programs.
Of course, if you ask people whether they create a job just for refugees, they won't. The question is what the alternative is and what the deal and the price is. And here again there are ways to encourage small and medium enterprises, even in some of the most fragile contexts, to create jobs and to look in a different way to their investments as we move forward. So there are very concrete things. There are concrete things that the international community can do. Everybody knows Lebanon is not entitled as a middle-income countries to receive special grants from the World Bank. But Lebanon has a specific problems. Millions, 1.5, 2 millions of refugees in the country being an important burden on the economy. So it's obviously a decision which needs to be addressed politically. You can't expect from neighboring countries to foot the bill, to take the refugees, to foot the bill, not to get any assistance from the international community. So there will be political decisions to take in the major financial institutions in order to create supportive environment which encourage the neighboring countries to take the right decisions and to support them into those decisions. As humanitarians also, we have learned to look in a very different way to our programming. We are not doing programming in favor of Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries, because targeting specific programs to Syrian refugees is basically stigmatizing Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries and causing frictions and tensions in the neighboring countries. So what we have started to do is community support for social services in Lebanon. We support hospitals to deliver services to whoever is sick, and not a specific program for Syrian refugees. Because if you do it for Syrian refugees, you will have the next civil war basically emerging as you do it over time and space. So the design of humanitarian programs in order to address an issue, cope with a problem and not contribute to further tensions do no harm in the best sense of words in responding on a humanitarian level to the challenges is something which is of quite critical importance. I take your point that, or what you say is at the same time a hope I would have that the cost of the present conflicts in the Middle East in particular would somehow entice governments to change their priorities. As long as there is no cost, there is no interest to stop the war in Syria. I think there is an enormous cost or perceived costs of the Syrian crisis now and the front line moving from Syria north. And this leads to a reassessment on where you invest your key political energies. My concern at the present moment is that those decisions which have been taken are not going into that direction. Basically, the decisions coming out of some of the European countries is rerouting humanitarian and development money to care for refugees in Sweden, the Netherlands, and whatever. And so this siphons positive contributions to the development of and stabilizations of the regions back to dealing with refugees. It's a zero-sum game which is of concern to us. In terms of political energy, we see a little bit more hope, because if we wouldn't have had this reaction, we wouldn't see a ceasefire or something like a cessation of hostilities in part of Syria as we see it today. So there is hopefully a reassessment and pondering of where the costs and opportunities are, and as humanitarians we have said in a long time, and I've been criticized for saying it, as humanitarians we can't cope with the humanitarian consequence of the Syrian problem. It's too big. We can only start again to be in reasonable dimensions of response if some of the underlying political causes of the conflict are addressed. And as long as this is not happening, at least to contain some of the most extreme violence, we will not see a fundamental change in the dynamic of the conflict, which has now been for 4 years the same. Each and every month we do more humanitarian work, and each and every month the situation gets worse. And so if you don't change the mechanics of it, which means to address the underlying drivers of violence in terms of a political settlement of the crisis, and I would add as a humanitarian in terms of respect for international humanitarian law by the parties to the conflict and meaningful pressure on the parties to the conflict to respect, we will not see a change of a dynamic, and the dynamic most likely will lead to more population displacements. In that sense, Jennifer, I'm a little bit cautious to extrapolate and sort of speculate on what exactly population movements are. What strikes me when I talk on the ground in Syria and in Afghanistan to people, and I ask the question, what makes you move? And where do you who takes the decision to move where? It's a very delicate equation. And the delicate equation is that, I mean, we think it's simple arithmetic, but for the people in Afghanistan and Syria, what surprises me is how rational and calculated they are in pondering 30 factors of positive and negative and reassessing them by the day and adapting them to the signals and opportunities which come out of the international politics. You can go to the farthest 100 kilometers out of Maurer Sharif where I spoke to 15 or 20 elders in a village. They know every word of every European politician who has pronounced itself in the last 12 hours on the migration issue. And they make an assessment whether this means that the chances are bigger or less. And they calculate it to the threats under which they are. They have the Taliban's in front of the village, and they have European politicians saying things. And they make an assessment on how this fits, and they take decisions. And it's very unforeseeable how those dynamics unfold. So you can easily imagine that despite all the fears one may have, we may not see an increase of population movement because many people may find that the threshold of going to a safe place is too big. They may change alternative places. I was very impressed to see that in Afghanistan there is a fascinating sort of mapping of the world on what first, second, third, fourth choices are. When you are poor, your first choice is Iran or Pakistan. And your first choice is not to go to Iran and Pakistan as a legal worker. It's going as an illegal worker to Iran and Pakistan, because in the pondering of the choices, it's better to be exploited as an illegal in Iran or Pakistan than staying in the village where you are. When you have the resources, you know exactly the market price for smugglers from Mazar al-Sharif to Munich. And depending on what your assets are and your possibilities are, you may decide to invest. And the family may decide that one person of the family